it's been a challenging time, I would say, over the last few years for unproven cell therapies. We've seen a lot of growth in this industry. And I'm speaking initially in the US context. We've seen my sense, monitoring this is that there are just an increasing number of clinics opening all over the country. And, it's probably happening all over the world as well. ISCT has been tracking these, this set of clinics and this practice, sort of the growth of unproven cell therapies. And we see a lot of this. In the US context, I would say it's primarily, although not exclusively, been in the area of orthopedics. And we've really seen that sector entrenched with an increasing number of clinics offering these services directly to consumers. I think this poses a really interesting challenge for ISCT and for regulators. As you know, in the United States, we're coming to an end of a period of regulatory discretion from the US Food and Drug Administration. And so this is, as I said, a really interesting time. The FDA has clarified its guidelines, and as a part of that has made it very clear that many of these clinics really need to start clinical trials, need to enter a more formal regulatory process. My sense from listening to FDA and reading their publications is that this really hasn't happened. Not nearly as many of the clinics as they had hoped have entered this process and begun clinical trials. And instead, what we're seeing is just a whole host of these clinics continuing to operate probably in defiance of FDA. I mean, I used to say in ignorance of FDA, but I think increasingly it's in defiance of FDA. And as enforcement discretion ends, it's going to be really interesting for the field. It's going to be really an important time for FDA and an important time for ISCT to see what's going on and to continue helping shape this practice and really ensure the development of the field, protect patients going forward. I think it's an open question, what will happen as FDA enforcement discretion ends? Will there be a host of enforcement actions taken? I think ISCT would like to see an increased level of activity there. I know personally I would like to see increased activity. But we also know that FDA has been strapped. Their budget for enforcement is not nearly what it should be. And there are a whole host of other priorities that FDA has to deal with as well. To their credit, FDA has highlighted unproven cell therapies as a key area of attention. But obviously, we have the COVID pandemic. We have a lot of other things for a food and drug regulator to address, right? And so their attention is understandably pulled in multiple directions. So it will be interesting to monitor. And that brings me to your question about COVID-19. And absolutely, that has complicated the world of unproven cell therapies. It's created an environment where health information and health misinformation is rampant, right? Not just in social media, but coming from the highest levels of government in certain cases, right? And making it really hard to make that case strongly that information needs to be accurately provided, verified, and almost certified before it gets out there to consumers. And so certainly some clinics, not all, but some clinics took advantage of the chaos, if you will, of the early days of the pandemic to market and increase their marketing of what I would consider, and I think what ISCT would consider, unproven cell-based interventions, claiming that they might treat COVID, claiming that they did treat COVID, claiming that they would reduce susceptibility to COVID, all of these sorts of things. And frankly, this was unfortunately done in almost all cases without solid evidence. And, and maybe in some cases with the earliest hints of preclinical evidence or evidence from a small case study. Pandemics are trying times for health policy. There is a lot of urgency, and we do really want to develop new therapies. And, I think there's reason to be excited about cell therapies and their potential in some cases to help with COVID-19. But absolutely, these therapies need to be developed appropriately. They need to gather sound evidence so we know, one, if they're safe, and two, if they're effective. And as has been the case in this industry of unproven therapies, there are operators out there that are willing to sort of sidestep or bypass this process and market directly to consumers. And we certainly saw that in the case of COVID. Now, I would note, I think FDA did a good job in this case, or at least a better job than they had in other contexts of stepping in here. They did up their enforcement activity when there were public claims made about, for instance, efficacy of a new therapy to treat COVID-19. And they did this in a trying political climate, but they did issue a substantial number of warning letters, both to to cell therapies making unsupported COVID claims, as well as a whole host of other therapeutics broadly, I guess is fair to say. And so the one other point I want to make about the landscape of unproven therapies is ISCT has seen a growth in what I would call cell banking services, and I think should be characterized as speculative cell banking services. These are firms that will take your cells or anyone's cells who's willing to pay the sort of processing and storage fee, and then freeze these cells for potential later use. It's a diverse industry. Companies will take MSCs from the pulp of baby teeth from children. They'll take their cells from hair follicles. They'll take skin biopsies, just a whole host of these cells, process them in a wide variety of ways, and then charge you a yearly fee in the hope that maybe you can use them later on. I don't think ISCT as a whole is opposed to cell banking, but we are concerned that cell banking is being commercialized prematurely and in a way that is taking advantage of patients. The claims that are made on some of these websites and some of the marketing materials they're just going too far today. And, that could be misleading and confuse patients, leading people to spend money really that they ought not to be spending for this. And then, frankly, there's a real regulatory concern here. As you know, the regulatory process for cell therapies is critical and complicated, right? There's this sort of idea that the process you use is the product, and what that really means is that the steps are critical. FDA or other health authorities want to know exactly what you're doing to these cells. And ISCT just doesn't see that the cell banking services out there today have really engaged in the regulatory process in a meaningful way, such that these cells could actually be used clinically. So we're concerned about that, the development of these cell banks. Not that cell banking ought not to develop, but that the way it's developing today is problematic and actually parallels some of the early development of the unproven cell therapy industry. So that's something the ISCT Presidential Task Force on Unproven Cell Therapies in particular is monitoring going forward.